much, Kate. Another incredibly rich presentation. So much to think about. One thing that I thought of was you talked a lot about Medellin and the culture of enterprise. You know, the paisas are famous in Colombia for literally embodying that culture, that spirit of enterprise. It made me think how important is that kind of innate or historical enterprise culture to this work, and how therefore, you know, the paisas might say, well, other parts of Colombia needn't bother. It would be an interesting question to look at. Very keen to bring in everyone because I'm sure you've got lots of interesting questions. We've got two panellists who could hardly be more appropriate to talk about these. If you want to join us, Professor, to talk about these subjects. We're very, very pleased to be able to welcome the Colombian ambassador to Britain here. Much more than an ambassador, you may not know, he's the founder and former director of Portfolio, which is a very prominent Colombian economic and finance newspaper. Been a journalist for various outlets in Colombia. Used to work with Dow Chemical for a bit, and is a very eminent academic in his own right, having written a number of books on management and economics. So very interested to see what you have to say.
Thank you.
I thought we'd ask Professor Gilbert to speak first, though.
Sure.
Professor Gilbert is Professor Emeritus at University College London, social scientist, economist, also has a doctorate in literature. Is that correct?
Yeah, but not from writing novels.
Right.
It's an honorary title.
Oh, right. I was quite impressed by that.
I may yet write a novel.
Okay. Has worked on housing, poverty, employment, urban problems, especially in Latin America, and has advised a whole range of very important international organisations. So we thought roughly 10 minutes each, and then of course bring in the everyone else to speak. The mic. And you will of course be able to answer questions just like the presenters.
Okay. In context, I've been going to Colombia for 45 years. Hope it doesn't show. And I have visited quite frequently Medellin. I know quite a lot about it, but if I know anything about Colombia, it's increasingly Bogota oriented. And I've recently been working on what Milford would call the local developmental state in Bogota, and how urban governance has improved there over the years. Now, what is the local development state? Well, I think virtually every big city around the world would now claim to be one. So I don't think it's all that new. I mean, what Ken Livingstone was doing, Boris Johnson is doing here, is what I would understand to be a local development state. Increasingly, everyone is talking about cities competing in the world economy rather than countries, and some are talking about countries disappearing. There was an article in Semana, I think last week, talking about Colombia DF and talking about 5 new regions evolving in the country. So there's nothing new. And it's particularly not new, I would argue, in Antioquia and Medellin, who have been at this game for at least a century. They are developmentalists and entrepreneurial from their soul. And part of Paisa culture, which Jonathan referred to, I mean, it's the one group in the country who truly have pride in their region, which makes them very unusual. And the reason they have pride in their culture is because they have some combination of Catholicism, entrepreneurship, hard-working culture. As a result of that, for long they were suspected of having Jewish origins, which is largely a nonsense. But this was spread, I suspect, by mischievous Bogotanos over the years. It certainly isn't true, but there is a culture of development in. And they have used this over the years to, it essentially begins with private enterprise. There are mythical stories about paisas in Colombia and abroad and their entrepreneurial skills. There was a TV program a few years back which found a Paisa living in Saudi Arabia selling camels to the Arabs. And that sums up the tradition of entrepreneurship in Medellin. They, on the basis of coffee, which developed first in Antioquia, spread south to Viejo Caldas, Quindío. They set up the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros. They were the first industrial city in Colombia. They set up ANDI, the Association of Industrialists. So there's this long tradition of, in my terms, the private sector using very effectively the state in order to further the interests of the private sector. And they've been magical at this. Now, Milford has suggested that Medellin is somehow left-wing. Now, I think that couldn't be farther from the truth. I think the whole culture of Medellin and Antioquia is anti-socialist. Now, it's very prepared to use the state, but it is not pro-state, and it's certainly not socialist. Sergio Fajardo was not from the Polo Democrático. He may have allied recently with a mayor who was Democratic Pole, along with Enrique Peñalosa and Antanas Mocos, but he is not a socialist. Indeed, with his background of wealth, he can hardly be a socialist. So I would discount that this is a socialist city in any way. To support that, if we look at taxation, they have very low taxes in Medellin, not a sign of a socialist city. They have effectively used valorization taxes more effectively than anyone else in Colombia, but that again, it's using the state in ways in which the private sector needs help. It's not a sign of socialism. The municipality, the Empresas Públicas de Medellin, is a very impressive organization, not just power, but also water, natural gas, all sorts of things, and is spreading its tentacles into Bogota. It has some of the concessions for electricity distribution in Bogota. It's spread abroad. It's a very effective organization, and one much understudied, because everybody says public organizations don't work. This one does. But again, it operates commercially. It's not a socialist organization. It's not left-wing. It's a perfectly functioning commercial organization which happens to be publicly owned. So that's a discussion. As an annex to that, perhaps, if Antioqueños are not renowned for their left-wing nature, the last two presidents of Colombia who came from Antioquia, Álvaro Uribe, and before that, the conservative Belisario Betancourt. Neither, by any stretch of the imagination, could be described as being very much left of Genghis Khan. Now, what Medellin has an advantage, like all relatively wealthy cities, in that because it has quite a lot of wealth, it can generate loans from abroad, from the World Bank and the American Development Bank, because it has a decent sized budget. Bogota does that, Medellin does it. Not many other cities in Colombia have that capacity to do so. And it's, according to the latest ranking of competitiveness of cities in Latin America, it's ranked 15th in Latin America. Miami's number 1, which I don't think counts really, so it's really 14. Bogota is 8th and Cali is 22nd. So is it coincidence that the largest 3 cities are all in order and all the others are way down? No, because it gives you a huge advantage to start with. So in that sense, Medellin, with its entrepreneurial culture, its tradition of trading abroad, its tradition now of setting up, arguably Medellin set up the first Latin American transnational corporation, headed by, of course, Pablo Escobar. It does not seem to me to be a coincidence that the first major cartel was run by a paisa. Anyway, enough of that. What are the what are the barriers to the local development state taking off in Medellin? The first one has already been mentioned to an extent, is violence. Medellin went through a desperately awful period during Pablo Escobar's running around, when murders went up to about 350 per 100,000. London, for context, is 2.5. So London's not the safest city, but Medellin with 350 was certainly distinctly unsafe. It then dropped back down to 30, partly because of the help of Don Berna, a drug leader who followed Pablo Escobar and brought, just in the same way as the mafia and the Yakuza bring order to their localities, he brought order to the city. But now, unfortunately, it seems that the murders have shot up again. In 2010, there were 2,019 murders in Medellin, which gave it 87 murders per 100,000 people, which ranked it as the 10th most unsafe city in the world. That is a barrier to the local development state. Second is that Medellin traditionally has a relatively high unemployment rate, which I'm not quite sure how it fits in with this informality and entrepreneurship. I've always associated it with the tradition of large-scale industry in Medellin. Currently, Medellin has got a 14.3% unemployment rate. Bogota is about 8% at the moment, but there are other cities in Colombia like Pereira, which it was 22%, so it's in the middle. But that's and it has a lot of poverty. But what is distinguishing about Medellin is currently it is the most unequal city in Colombia, and followed by everyone else. I mean, they're all unequal, but Medellin is the most unequal of all the unequal ones, and that's worrying. Because if you're going to help anybody, it's those at the bottom. And it's going to be very difficult because of this inequality. One or two comments about the strategy as I understanding it. Milford mentioned that you've got to develop non-local markets. Now, I hadn't thought about that, but I wonder whether that's right. And I suddenly thought of Marks and Spencer's, the well-known Medellin store. Marks and Spencer's began as a market stall in Leeds many years ago, and it is still essentially a British firm. It's tried spreading out into Europe and then retracted. It's about to start again in Paris. The Parisians are delighted. But if Marks and Spencer's became such an effective organization, starting with local markets, surely one way of doing it is to develop your local market first, a niche in your local market, and then spread outwards, gradually, expanding outwards. So I wonder if you do need immediately to go to non-local. And I was looking at Kate's success story. Now, there's several interesting things about this. First of all, she was not poor. If she's stratum 4, that puts her in the top 10% of the distribution of homes by affluence. So she's probably decently educated, I don't know, but intuiting from her home, she starts off with a big advantage to start with. And she's done. She has, who she sold to? The local stores in Medellin. Now, they may take her products to other cities in Colombia. So she's doing a Marks and Spencer's from the bottom up. So I'd be interested in your comments about whether you do need to go local. You start with a local market and you spread outwards. Another thing about too many institutions. Yes, that's a common problem everywhere in Colombia. Probably look at aid and NGOs in this country. There are far too many of them. They should get together. Colombia's hopeless. Universities, they don't speak to one another. They don't sell one another's books. They're terribly, egocentric. They don't work together. So I'd like to think they would get together, but I'm a little skeptical. Now, women and the role of women. Now, you've plugged a bit too hard, the poor women here. But you've missed. There are, poor men as well, and some men and women do work in harmony together, and so on. But okay, enough of that. One thing that you've missed out, along with virtually everybody else in the world, in terms of opportunity and home enterprise, is where do lots of people in Medellin live? They live not in their own house, they live in somebody else's house. They rent. Who is the more typical landlord? It is a widow or a lady. Women run renting businesses. But I never hear, when anyone's talking about informal enterprise, micro-enterprise, talking about the role of the house. The house is a generator of income. If you're retired, you have your own house. What do? You rent out 2 or 3 rooms. Now, that's one area where CEDESO and the Banco de las Oportunidades could actually get involved in. Lend the money to put in some bathrooms. Yeah, sorry. Anyway, well, that's enough.
It's really interesting. But I'm really keen to bring in everyone, because I know that everyone's going to have lots of questions, and I'll definitely bring you back